Welcome to the Ohio Farm Bureau webinar covering all things CAUV. I'm Ty Higgins, and CAUV, of course, standing for Current Agricultural Use Value, and that's increased substantially following the 2024 reappraisal and update, affecting 24 counties that have now seen new tax bills this year. Some counties have reported CAUV increases between 80 and 100%. Why are values increasing, and how do property taxes respond? That's why we're here, and that's why you are here to discuss the recent increases in CAUV values, share information to help you understand the property tax system, and get an update on legislative action being taken on this front. This webinar will last about an hour. It is being recorded, and we'll post it on our website a little bit later on today. So if you happen to miss something or have to step away for a little bit, you can always find it a little bit later on at ohiofarmbureau.org. Of course, the Q&A section is ready for you as well as we have this conversation. You can drop your questions or comments in that Q&A, and many of you have done that through the registration process. We have some of those questions all ready to go after today's presentation. So if you submitted a question, we may be able to get to it here within this hour. And of course, as we talk about CAUV and some of the changes needed, that can't happen without membership. We have strengthened members at Ohio Farm Bureau, and if you want to help us seek those property tax changes, it always helps to become an Ohio Farm Bureau member, and you can do that as well at ohiofarmbureau.org. I want to introduce to you Leah Curtis. She's Associate General Counsel for Ohio Farm Bureau. And Leah, before we get to the presentation, this has been something you've talked about for a long time. How long have you been on the beat, so to speak, for CAUV with Ohio Farm Bureau?
So I've been on the CAUV beat for about 14 years, almost 15 now. I started at Farm Bureau full-time in 2011, and so I've been on the CAUV trail since that time, and gone through lots of ups and downs with CAUV, but ultimately just really become very familiar with the program, with the calculation, and also just trying to help our members understand it as it goes through all the different iterations of what happens with taxes.
Yeah, you mentioned over that time you've seen just about everything from the major reform we saw several years back to what we're seeing now with higher increases. So that's why this webinar is so important, because it is a very complex system. There are a lot of things that go into the values that ebb and flow every so often. And so as you go through this presentation, the main question everybody wants to know, and what you're going to be answering here for us today: why are CAUV values increasing? Leah Curtis, take it away.
Yep, so we will get to ultimately answering that question here in just a few minutes, but I like to start with talking a little bit about the basics of our property tax system, the basics of the calculation that's used to create those CAUV values, and then we'll get to kind of what's happening today with CAUV values. All of this is to help you all understand this system that not only applies to your CAUV property, but also your houses, your buildings, and all the other property in your area. And a big reason for that is we at Farm Bureau, we are a policy organization, but all of our policy comes from our members. So the more all of you have that background information, the better policy we can develop as we get through into our policy development session every year. So we'll get started here with your property taxes. First thing I always like to cover is that there are two constitutional requirements for property taxes. First is the requirement that land be valued for taxation at its true value in money. And this generally means that it's going to be valued at its market value, which is the value that the property would change hands between a willing seller and a willing buyer. The one exception to the true value requirement is CAUV, and that's due to an amendment that was passed by the electorate in 1973, and that allows us to have property valued at its agricultural value instead of its market value. The second constitutional requirement that often comes into play is the uniform enroll requirement. And this means that generally how we operate the property tax system has to be the same regardless of the type of property. So what we do to one property, we have to do to the other. The exception to this is that there are two classes of property. Class 1, which is residential and agricultural property, and then Class 2, which is all other property like commercial and industrial. The classes are largely for the application of the tax reduction factor, which we will discuss later on, and this also is from an amendment that was passed in 1981. The next important thing to know about your property taxes is when you will see changes in value. The changes in value happen on a regular schedule. So every 6 years, your property goes through a reappraisal. Every 3 years after that, there's what's called a triennial update. This essentially means that every 3 years, your property value is going to be reviewed. At a reappraisal, there's generally a more extensive review of your property, including a possible visual inspection. And at the triennial update, the auditor is mainly looking at recent sales and comparing them to your property. Because CAUV is determined using the calculation from the tax department, it doesn't really matter whether it's a reappraisal or update. Every 3 years, you'll see a change in your CAUV values. This map shows when those revaluations are happening throughout the state. You'll notice that there is not necessarily a geographical schedule, or it's not alphabetical. The counties in the yellow saw changes last in 2023. Those in the blue are those who just went through a reappraisal in 2024 and have just received new tax bills. And those in the green will be in a reappraisal this year and see new tax bills in January of 2026. Next is understanding how your value is taxed. So while you will see the appraised value on your tax bill, property taxes only apply to 35% of your total value. So you'll often see this referred to on your tax bill as the assessed value or the taxable value. There's also 4 components to your value. There's the value of your home, the value of the home site or the land that your home sits on, the value of buildings and improvements that are on the properties, so barns, garages, etc. And last is agricultural land. CAUV only applies to agricultural land. All of those other components of your property are valued at fair market value. The land portion, though, that can qualify for CAUV will receive a CAUV value instead. Now that we've discussed the value, we want to talk about the other portion of how we determine your taxes, which is the rate or the millage rate. We're used to tax rates being shown to us as percentage, like with sales tax or income tax, but property tax rates are expressed as mills. So 1 mill is equal to 1/1000th of a dollar, or 10 mills equals 1%. The millage rate is what is used to determine how much you will pay in taxes compared to your property's taxable value. Your property tax bill is going to be made up of both unvoted and voted millage. The first 10 mills of the tax bill are unvoted, and those are called inside millage as they're inside the Constitution. The Constitution says that you will be taxed at 1% of your property's true value in money. Millage above that level has generally been voted on by you and the citizens within your taxing district, meaning your millage rate is going to be unique to the taxing district that you live in. We have a lot of taxing districts across the state of Ohio, and millage rates can range from lows of 20 or 25 mills up to over 200 mills, depending on the area where people live and what they voted for to be in their millage rate. The last and most complicated part of the property tax system here in Ohio is what we call the House Bill 920 effect, also known as the tax reduction factor. House Bill 920 was a bill passed in the 1970s intended to limit property taxes during a time of rapid inflation. The main principle of House Bill 920 is that whatever amount of money is raised from a levy in its first year on the tax bill, that's all the levy can raise every year thereafter. House Bill 920 applies to certain fixed rate levies, while fixed sum levies also operate in that same way by their very nature. So essentially what that means is a voted levy is going to collect what it collected in its first year every year thereafter. The goal from that is to prevent inflationary increases and windfalls from property tax collection, because it's always limited by what the original amount raised was. This is done by rolling down millage rates to collect the correct amount. And this is why you will see a gross millage rate, which is the full combination of unvoted and voted millage, and the effective millage rate, which is the rate that's actually charged to you after that reduction factor is applied to limit the collection. So when you hear that, you probably think, how do increases happen then? Well, House Bill 920 controls collection. The same amount of money is collected on the qualifying levies. House Bill 920 does have a few exceptions, one being the inside 10 mills. So those 10 mills will always collect 1%. And then millage for schools that have reached the 20 mil floor. One exception to House Bill 920 when it was passed was that school millage, if they had at least 20 mils of millage, would not roll below that 20 mil floor. So they will collect the full amount of 20 mils, as well as the inside 10 mils will collect the full 10 mils. And again, the House Bill 920 reduction factor is calculated by looking at the total value of property in the district. It's not applying to each individual property. So practically, if a small group of properties go up in value a lot more than the average increase in a district, they will generally see more of an increase in taxes. Now let's talk a little bit about CAUV, or the Current Ag Use Valuation Program. So CAUV is a program that values land for its income producing potential from agricultural use only. So while we've talked about the other types of property, which are generally taxed based on their market value, CAUV is looking only at that agricultural use. The point of CAUV is to take development pressure out of the equation. And so that land is only going to consider agricultural data and agricultural factors to be valued rather than what it would sell for on the marketplace. The CAUV values are calculated by the Ohio Department of Taxation by soil type. So they calculate values for all 3,500 soil types across the state. Those values are presented to an Ag Advisory Committee, which has an opportunity to provide comment to the department. And then the department finalizes the values and sends them out to the county auditors. The county auditor in your county will then match up what soil types you have on your property to the soil values that have been provided to them, and they use that to determine your farm's unique CAV value. Every farm in the state of Ohio most likely has a unique CAV value because they're made up of unique soil types and unique amount of each soil type. And so that makes for a unique CAV value tailored to that farm. Those values come from a calculation, and that basic calculation is net income divided by capitalization rate. Now, it is a pretty complicated calculation, and we're not going to run all the way through it, but I will say we do have a webinar that we did last year where we walked step by step through the calculation and how it applied to one soil type. And if you're interested in that, it is on our website available for you to watch. But we're just going to kind of go through the high level review of the calculation today. So the calculation is based on 3 crops: corn, soybeans, and wheat. And those are the most prevalent field crops in the state of Ohio. And then we use 5 factors to determine each soil value. We start with the soil's unique yield for each crop from 1984, which is then updated using a 10-year average yield factor. Next, that yield is multiplied by crop prices, which are determined by using 7 years of data, dropping out the high and low, and averaging the remaining 5. The crop prices are taken from the National Ag Statistics Service Ohio data. Then we subtract out the non-land production costs. Costs are also, again, 7 years of data, dropping out the high and low, averaging the remaining 5. And these costs come from the OSU crop enterprise budgets that are prepared by the Ag Economics Department each year. Finally, the net income is multiplied by a cropping pattern, or the percent acres harvested of each of the 3 crops across the state. This is a 5-year average, again from the National Ag Statistics Service Ohio data, and that gives us a net income that's divided by a capitalization rate. The capitalization rate is made up of a debt rate based on a mortgage from Farm Credit Services and an equity rate based on the 25-year average return to farm equity from USDA. As I've gone through all these data sources, you may have noticed they're all coming from objective statewide data and multi-year averages. Additionally, keep in mind that every soil starts out with a unique yield for each crop, which means that lower productivity soils tend to have lower values, while higher productivity soils tend to have higher values. Again, that process is repeated for all 3,500 soil types. A cropland value and a woodland value are both determined. While generally most land is going to be categorized as cropland, land that is at least 30% wooded will be given the woodland value for soil. Woodland values are determined by taking the cropland value and subtracting the cost of clearing, as well as the cost of drainage for certain soils that are poorly drained, very poorly drained, or somewhat poorly drained. Finally, the tax department also sets minimum values. The cropland minimum value is $350 per acre, and the woodland minimum value is $230 per acre. Additionally, any land that has a slope above 25% is automatically set at the woodland minimum value of $230 per acre. Well, that's how the calculated CAV values work. There is an additional valuation opportunity when it comes to conservation lands. Lands that are used for conservation and have been certified to the county auditor can receive the lowest value in the CAV table, that being the minimum value we just talked about for woodland of $230 per acre. This can be land in a federal conservation program, land that has a conservation practice installed on it privately that will abate soil erosion and is up to 25% of the acreage. The conservation use has to remain on the land for at least 3 years, or the landowner will have to pay back the difference between the actual CAV value and what they paid on minimum value. This is a really unique opportunity for CAV landowners to control their property value, and was a very important part of the 2017 reforms to ensure that landowners were not punished for using good conservation practices on their land. So let's talk a little bit about the CAV reform, as Ty mentioned it at the beginning. Back in 2015, we took a number of steps through the tax department, including updating the data and the formula to be more timely, increasing the deductions that are used to determine woodland values, and updating the parameters of the interest rates to ensure that they're consistent with modern lending. Going further, in 2017, we were able to make legislative changes, particularly that targeted the capitalization rate and removed non-agricultural factors that were driving up our values and removing it from a connection to agriculture and the agricultural markets. We also, as we just discussed, ensured that conservation lands were more fairly valued through the program. These changes resulted in statewide average reductions of 30% in CAV values at each revaluation since that time. And over that 3-year valuation period, there were hundreds of millions of dollars in savings to farmers. And we know that without those reforms, we would be seeing much higher CAV values than we are today. So what's happened with CAV values in 2023 and 2024? CAV values increased substantially, as most of you know, in the 23 and the 24 reappraisal and update cycle. This was due largely to strong crop prices over the last several years. The CAV formula is intended and has always been intended to follow the farm economy. And as we've had a fairly strong farm economy in most recent years, those CAV values are responding accordingly. Costs have also increased, both in real life and in the calculation, but they have not increased at the same rate and over the same time frame as those crop prices have. Here you can see the crop prices that were used in the 2024 CAV formula for all 3 crops. As shown, the tax department does drop out the high and the low prices and averages the remaining 5. The department also deducts 5% for management costs. In 2024, ultimately, the prices that were used in the CAV calculation were $4.40 per bushel for corn, $10.81 for soybeans, and $5.52 for wheat. This again is the map that can help you see where your county is in the reevaluation schedule. Counties in yellow saw new values in tax bills in January 24 based on their 23 CAUV values. Counties in blue have just received new tax bills this January, and both sets of those counties have seen substantial increases in CAV values. If you happen to be in one of the green counties, we will be looking to see what your CAV values will look at as we move through this year. Typically, the tax department has a preview of those values in the spring. And as always, we will be providing information on what we're seeing once it's available. We typically have those updates around mid or late summer as to what those values are looking like. So why is this different than the CAV increases that many of you may remember from around 2010 to 2014? Well, at that time, those increases were being largely caused by the capitalization rate. And the capitalization rate was using a number of non-agricultural factors that were driving up the formula's value prices. And that was because they were being driven by what was happening in the broader economy, particularly after the 2008 recession. Today, our increases are largely being caused by steady and relatively higher crop prices that we've had over the last 7 years, as well as increasing yields that we've seen. So as we have had this strong agricultural economy over the last several years, that has driven the value increases. What people often ask is, does CAUV even still save money? And there's no doubt that CAUV saves property tax dollars for Ohio farmers across the state. In 2023, which is the most recent data we have available, the taxable CAUV value of all CAUV property in Ohio was 29% of that same property's taxable market value. Our mid-range soil in 2024 was valued at about $2,600 per acre for CAUV purposes, but USDA data would put that farmland value at over $9,000 per acre. This table is just showing the comparison between CAUV value total across the state and that same property's market value. So the blue bar is the CAUV value and the orange bar is that market value. The market value is what that property would be taxed on if it were not in the CAUV program.
Just a reminder that the Q&A is open. If you happen to have any questions as Leah goes through this, feel free to drop them in there and we'll get to the questions that you might have put in as you registered for this webinar a little bit later on. But Leah, the one question that I know you and I get quite often, what is Ohio Farm Bureau doing now to address higher CAUV values? There's a lot of work going on in this space.
Yeah, so CAUV is something that we are constantly working on. It's kind of never far from our minds at any point. And so we have, we talked about at the beginning, our policy is what we use to determine our advocacy and how we move forward on these issues. Our policy does support that CAUV be based on objective data, and it supports that we try to limit volatility in the formula. So we've met with the tax department to discuss this issue particularly, as well as our continued call with them to just regularly and thoroughly review this calculation. CAUV was first started in 1973. There's been small tweaks throughout the years, but we continue to try to look for, are there ways that we can improve it and modernize it as the agricultural economy has changed. We know that the spike in the value is the biggest concern, and that's what we are trying to work towards addressing. We also have to remember that CAUV is not the most popular program with everyone. There are a number of groups that oppose CAUV that do not like it. In 2023, an auditor testified at the State House that due to changes that were made in CAUV, that taxes had virtually been eliminated on agricultural land. So it is something that we also have to always be thoughtful of, that there are other groups out there that would like to see CAUV removed or diminished in some way. In the 2023 budget from the legislature, they did include a joint legislative committee to review property taxes, in part due to our advocacy. We were invited to testify to help that committee understand CAUV and how it fits into this larger property tax system. And we highlighted there particularly the concerns of volatility and needed predictability. We also talked more generally about the property tax system because, as many of you know, you've also seen large increases in the value of your homes and your buildings and that as well. So we talked about the property tax system, the inflationary aspects of your tax bill that caused those largest increases. Later in the process, we were also able to have our board member, Matt Altman, testify on his experience. The committee did release a report at the end of the year, and we do anticipate that the legislature is going to continue to use that report as a reference, as well as some recommendations to work on property taxes in general. And we will, of course, be continuing to work through our advocacy to provide information and advocate for CAUV, as well as looking at the larger property tax system as a whole. One major win that we did have from this year is the change in woodland values. So after years of lobbying the tax department, along with our partners, including the Forestry Association, who was able to provide market data to them, the tax department did agree to update woodland deductions to match the actual cost of clearing and drainage. So remember, I mentioned before, woodland values are cropland values where we make deductions for clearing and sometimes drainage. So beginning with the 2024 reappraisal, nearly all woodland values are going to be at or near the minimum value of $230 per acre. And this is an important win that we've been working towards for a number of years, including being involved with litigation, filing 2 separate amicus curiae briefs with the Supreme Court to explain to them how CAUV works and why this was important to do, and to make sure it did match the market costs. So that has started with the 24 reappraisal. We will likely see that moving forward. We've also asked the tax department to make sure that this is not a one-time update, that this is something that just like we update crop prices and we update costs every year, this is something that also needs to be updated and reviewed every single year.
Of course, it's important to get this information out, what's happening right now with CAUV, but there could be some changes on the horizon, and especially as we work through this joint committee in Columbus, how can folks stay engaged and informed about CAUV as our work continues?
So we have a number of publications and resources from Farm Bureau about CAV. It's something that we are doing stories about on our website constantly. So if you are a member, hopefully you are, if you're joining us today, you should be getting Buckeye Farm e-news every so often, every Friday, I think, in your mailbox. We are often adding CAV stories in that, updating you on what's happening. We have a Legal with Leah podcast where we also always update once we have new information about CAV, as well as our Ohio magazine. Last year, we did an entire issue just on CAV, talking about these issues and the increase in values, along with all of the stories that we keep on our website. So if you are a member, you should be getting all of these publications, but please stay tuned to our website. If you're ever wondering what's up, you can go to the website, search for CAV, and you'll see the most recent information there as well.
Leah kind of teased that deeper dive webinar we did last year about CAUV. If you're more curious about that and want to see that very long calculation that goes into CAUV values, if you search on ohiofarmbureau.org, CAUV 202. So this is the 101 course. We did a 202 course on CAUV. So search CAUV 202 on our website, and you'll be able to find that webinar and see that. I failed algebra twice, Leah, so those types of calculations scare me. Let's get to some questions, and I want to start with a couple that we got during the registration process to give those folks a chance to hear their questions and get the answers from Leah. First one, of course, you mentioned the fact that we've seen higher commodity prices over the past several years. Obviously, we have not seen those higher prices here over the last 1, 2, 3 years, and they're wanting to know if you can make a forecast of when the lower commodity prices we're seeing now will start to bring taxes down.
So I do want to start by saying, as soon as they give me a crystal ball, I'm going to use it for good, I promise. As Ty said, we have seen lower prices obviously now. And keep in mind, as I said at the beginning, your property values are updated every 3 years. So at your next reappraisal, that means there's going to be 3 new years of data. Due to our changes and reforms that were done in 2015, we are only 1 year behind on prices that are in the calculation. So that means, for example, this year, 2024 revaluation, 2023 was the most recent year of crop prices that are in there. So at your next reappraisal, you will see those most recent 3 years of data in the formula, and that should help to help with that averaging and kind of counteracting some of those higher prices from historical data that are in the calculation now.
Next question, will our CAUV woodland acreage be valued at a lower level in 25 than the recent past?
So if you're on the 2024 revaluation or the 2025 revaluation, so if you're going into your revaluation this year, you'll get a new tax bill in 26. You should see those lower woodland values. If you were in the 23 revaluation, you will most likely not see that change until you get to your next reappraisal, unfortunately, which would be 2026. So that is because of the reappraisal cycle and that 3-year cycle that applies to all property taxpayers. It will take that time until we get to your next reappraisal. But if you were in the 2024 reappraisal, just got your new tax bill, it should be there. If you're in 25, you should see it on your next reappraisal in 26.
One of our participants wants to know if you can speak to the requirement to break out their land in various uses like ditches and roadways.
Sure. So when you apply for CAV, which I will just make a quick plug, you do need to renew your CAV every year. That needs to be done before the first Monday in March. So I believe that is February 28th this year that you want to get that form back to your auditor. So please don't forget to do that. Please take the time, maybe even this week, to get that done. So on that form, you are delineating out the different types of uses. That's for a couple reasons. One, the auditor has to do a yearly inspection of properties on CAUV. Remember, CAUV is a program that you have to qualify to be into. Not everybody can get CAUV. So having that delineation of uses helps with that inspection, helps them know what they should be looking for. Things like ditches and roadways that might have a right of way from the government or from a utility on them, those typically are not taxed. So having those, set out, the auditor can review those on your property and make sure that things are being taxed appropriately. Otherwise, if there is land that's not used for agriculture, there are opportunities for the auditor to do what's called split listing properties. Generally, we don't see that happen on CAUV properties unless the property is being used for some other commercial use. If it is land that is incidental to the agricultural use, so maybe you're not specifically using it to grow corn, but it's where you enter or exit the field, that is something that probably should still be considered within your CAV acreage. The other thing I'll just say about delineating is the conservation land. Where you do have conservation land, delineating that out, providing a map of it to the auditor, you can work with the auditor to get that lowered conservation value applied to that portion of the property. But they have to know where it is to be able to match up the value. So having that delineated out on that form is helpful for that as well.
Can you ask for a reassessment or oppose the new value?
So you are able to always challenge a property value through the board of revision process. Because CAUV is different than a market value valuation, it is more difficult. Generally, we do not see CAV values change through that process because the auditor has not set that value. Now, things that do get challenged from CAUV through the BOR could be things like your soil types. If your soil types were not correct on your tax bill, if they have the incorrect soil types, that's something that can be corrected. The delineation of property, so maybe you have some woodland that's been charged a cropland value. That's something that can be challenged and dealt with that way. But overall, the soil values, while you can file an appeal, generally you will see those upheld because the auditor has not set them. Now, that doesn't mean it can't go forward. It doesn't mean that will always be the case, but it is more difficult to challenge CAV values. Values on your house, on your buildings, things that are market value, those are based on sales. And those, of course, can also be challenged through the Board of Revision as well. And you can use other evidence to show why those values should be less.
Another woodland question here for you. If you sell a woodland that has been in CAUV and the new owner does not stay in CAUV, what happens?
So this is a great question for something else that we didn't really talk about, but if you're in the CAV program and you come out, you will owe what's called recoupment. Recoupment is 3 years worth of tax savings. So what you did pay versus what you would have paid. You pay that back for the last 3 years. We often get this question about land sales. First of all, whenever a land sale is made of property that's in CAUV, that should be disclosed in the sale. There's actually a form that you generally sign at closing that people, are made aware of CAUV and the possibility of recoupment. The recoupment attaches to the property, or it's charged to the property once that property is converted to a non-agricultural use. So either typically that's going to be the buyer that ends up paying it, right? Because they're the ones that are probably going to either stop managing the woodlands or not renew the CAUV status. But again, it is always a good idea to talk about it during the land sale, make sure people are aware of it, because you don't want that surprise to come up later and then them to come back to you angry that they didn't know.
Interesting one here. Why isn't there a cap on how much taxes can increase per year? It seems hard to understand why one farm can increase 81% and another farm 1 mile away increases 67% and both yield the same per acre.
So there's a few things in this question I want to talk about first. So keep in mind that two farms can be fairly close to each other, but have two very different tax rates. So depending on where you live, you have may have different tax rates applied to you. I've talked to people who've had, the person across the road has a different emergency district or library district or something, and that has made a difference in what their millage rate is. So always keep that in mind. And then also, as we talked about CAUV values, remember that CAUV values are unique to your farm because they're based on your unique soil types and the unique makeup of soil types on your farm. And as we know, oftentimes within a county, we have, a lot of, maybe 5 or 10 soil types, but the amount of acreage of each soil type could be different for each farm. But after that, those two things that could explain a difference in change in value or in taxes, we don't have a law that says we limit increases in value or increases in taxes. What we have in Ohio is that House Bill 920 that I talked about, which is a limit on collection. So other states do have limits on value changes, but they don't have limit on collection. We have the opposite. So that is the property tax control that we currently have in the law, is that House Bill 920 that limits the collection side rather than the value or the rate side.
If buildings are used for ag purposes, why are they not taxed at a CAUV rate?
This is a great question too that we get sometimes. So when CAUV was passed as a constitutional amendment, it specifically says that you can have a use value for land. It does not say you can have a use value for buildings or improvements. So CAUV only applies to land. It does not apply to buildings. Buildings are still going to be valued at their market value. Now, if you have a concern about the building value, again, you can challenge that through the Board of Revision. You can look at, what is values of maybe other people in your taxing district or in your county that have similar buildings. If those are vastly different or lower, or you have good evidence as to why your building should be valued lower, that's something that can be challenged. But CAUV can only apply to land. It can't apply to improvements or buildings.
Does permanent land conservation easements make a difference in value? How is that considered by auditors?
So permanent conservation easements are something that will affect market value, of course. If that land is on CAUV and it's being used for agricultural use, it's most likely already going to have the reduced CAUV value. If it were not on CAUV, then the market value should take into account the reduction in value due to the conservation easement. Generally, what we see across the state is most conservation easements are in the CAUV program, and so they're already receiving the lowered CAUV value as compared to the market value. And so they're already at a lowered value, and that's generally what we've seen them have as their taxable value, is the CAUV value.
What is the database that's used to construct the soil map? I think you might have mentioned that a little bit, but we'll do a refresher here.
Yeah, so the soil map comes from the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service soil map. You can access that. It's websoilsurvey.com. So if you want to go and look up what is on your farm from that soil survey, you can do that. You can also visit with NRCS, Soil and Water, FSA. Any of those offices can generally help you with a soil map of your property. And then you can also work with the auditor to see what they have recorded for the soil types and acreage amounts for your property. But generally, the auditor has that soil map overlaid over the property map, and that's what they're using to determine your soil types.
Next question is about the homestead reduction. Does this apply to a single member LLC owning the property? The single member is a senior citizen.
Oh, that is a good question that I don't know I know the answer to off the top of my head. I didn't know we were playing Stump the Lawyer, Ty. So that is something I would have to look into a little bit because it's just off the top of my head. I have not looked into the LLC aspect of the senior homestead exemption. Yeah, I don't want to even speculate because I just don't know off the top of my head. But if that member wants to send an email, we can try to find out some information on that as well.
This is a little off the CAUV path, but still with the county auditor in mind. Any information on some auditors creating separate parcel numbers for severed mineral ownership? Example, I transferred my minerals to an LLC or trust. They create a new parcel for it. Are there intentions of taxing the mineral rights?
So when the mineral rights are severed from the overall property, they generally are created as a parcel. So that's a normal practice. Um, Typically, that parcel is not going to be taxed until it is productive. So if there is production happening, I believe is when it triggers the taxation of that parcel. I don't believe there is until that time. I probably should have said should check into it because it's been a long time since I've looked at that issue, but it is common. I will say it is very common, and I believe it is required actually by law to, once that severed happens, that that there is a parcel number created and a parcel created for it. I just don't believe it's taxed until it's productive. Again, that's something we can certainly look into for someone and provide them some more kind of robust information if they'd like to send us an email.
Next question. My value seems to be going up more than what you're saying. Why?
So when we are talking about, values went up about 100%, we are looking at a few indicator soils. Again, remember there's 3,500 soils across the state. So we are looking at individual soil values. Again, you have a unique value for your property that is based on all your soil types. So we are using kind of the average and what those indicator soils have done to give that range of increase, but everybody's going to see a little bit different. The other thing is, keep in mind that when you look at your total property value, it's usually a combination of CAV as well as your buildings. Your buildings, your house, etc., all of that is going to be uniquely based on where you live. So we've seen some counties that had 20 or 30% increases in houses and buildings. And we've seen some counties that have been a more modest 10% increase in buildings and houses. So it really just depends on what the sales have been in your area when we talk about that market value side. So the total property value, unless you have just a bare piece of ground, is going to be kind of a combination of all those things. And that will impact what increase or general increase you see.
That is it for the questions that we have today. But of course, we're always available for further questions after this webinar. And there are plenty of resources online at ohiofarmbureau.org. We're going to put a recording of this webinar on our website a little bit later on today. There's also a CAUV frequently asked questions page. If you search CAUV FAQ, you'll find that on our webpage as well. And Leah mentioned the Legal with Leah podcast that we do. We've talked about CAUV on the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. And of course, if you're an Ohio Farm Bureau member, you have access anytime to the Landowner Toolkit. Talks about CAUV and a number of other things that landowners may be facing as far as challenges. And that toolkit is available for members only at ohiofarmbureau.org. If you're not a member, this is a great time to sign up for a membership. We have strengthened members at Ohio Farm Bureau. Things get done because of our membership. And if you want to see changes made in CAUV and other aspects of what we're seeing and dealing with in rural Ohio, a membership through Ohio Farm Bureau is a great way to start. You'll be getting an email from us a little bit later on today if you're not a member, asking you to join and help us in all the things that we do at the local, state, and federal levels. Again, our website is ohiofarmbureau.org. Leah Curtis, Associate General Counsel for Ohio Farm Bureau. Great information as always, and thank you so much for laying it all out there for us.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you all have a great day.
I'm Ty Higgins. We'll see you down the road.